"Cut the music." Those 3 words were all it took. The crowd would erupt. The women would scream. The men would boo. And standing in the center of that ring, with a body chiseled from granite and an ego the size of Texas, was a man who had perfected the art of being hated. A man who, on the morning of April 20th, 1999, would take his last breath at just 40 years old, leaving behind a wife, 3 young children, and a legacy that professional wrestling has never truly reckoned with. This is the story of the final 48 hours of ravishing Rick Rude. But to understand how a man who once stood as the physical embodiment of perfection ended up on the floor of his Alpharetta, Georgia home with empty prescription bottles scattered around him, you have to understand everything that led him to that moment. You have to understand the pain, the bitterness, the broken promises, and the relentless, unforgiving toll that professional wrestling takes on the bodies and minds of the men and women who give everything to entertain us. Richard Irwin Rude was born on December 7, 1958, in the small town of St. Peter, Minnesota. He grew up in Robbinsdale, a suburb of Minneapolis, in a time and place that seemed to produce professional wrestlers the way Detroit produced cars. Robbinsdale was home to an almost unbelievable concentration of future wrestling talent. Rick Rude grew up alongside Curt Hennig, Tom Zenk, John Nord, Barry Darsow, Nikita Koloff, and Brady Boone. These were kids who played football together on the same high school teams, competed in amateur wrestling together, and dreamed of making it big in the professional ranks. They were drawn to the business by the same forces that have always drawn young men to professional wrestling: the promise of fame, fortune, and the chance to test themselves against the toughest competitors in the world. Rude and Hennig were particularly close, forging a bond in their teenage years that would endure through decades of triumph and tragedy. The parallels between the 2 men are almost eerie. Both were physically gifted athletes who excelled at every sport they tried. Both would become famous for their vanity-based gimmicks. Both would suffer severe back injuries that cut their careers short. And both would die from drug overdoses before reaching middle age. It is one of the cruelest coincidences in the history of professional wrestling. After graduating from Anoka Ramsey Junior College with a degree in physical education, Rude found work as a bouncer. He was known even then for his extraordinary physical strength. People who knew him in those days said he could knock a man unconscious with an open-handed slap. He had the look, the power, and the attitude. All he needed was someone to show him how to channel it. That someone was Eddie Sharkey, the legendary Minnesota wrestling trainer who had also trained the Road Warriors, Bob Backlund, and countless others. Under Sharkey, Rude learned the fundamentals and began working as a babyface jobber named Ricky Rude in 1982. He bounced around the territories in those early years, working in Vancouver for NWA All-Star Wrestling, doing shots for Georgia Championship Wrestling, and eventually landing in Memphis for the Continental Wrestling Association. It was in Memphis where everything changed. Jerry Jarrett, one of the sharpest minds in the history of the business, saw something in this young, good-looking, muscular kid from Minnesota. Jarrett rechristened him Ravishing Rick Rude, gave him the song Smooth Operator as his entrance music, and turned him heel with a monstrous push. Paired with the Valet Angel, Rude became the top heel in one of the hottest territories in America, feuding with Jerry Lawler, Austin Idol, Randy Savage, and the Fabulous Ones. He was not yet a polished worker or a great talker, but his delivery was intense, his look was undeniable, and his arrogance made people want to pay money to see him get beaten. From Memphis, Rude moved through Florida, where he was managed by Percy Pringle, the man who would later become known to WWE fans as Paul Bearer. Rude captured the NWA Florida Southern Heavyweight Championship, defeating Pez Whatley for the gold in January 1985. He had notable feuds with Brian Blair and Wahoo McDaniel during his time in the Sunshine State, establishing himself as a credible singles champion who could carry a territory. He then worked in world-class championship wrestling in Texas, the Von Erich family's promotion, where he became the first-ever WCWA World Heavyweight Champion, adding yet another line to an already impressive resume. He spent time in Jim Crockett Promotions in the Carolinas, where he and Manny Fernandez formed the Awesome Twosome and won the NWA World Tag Team Championship from the Rock and Roll Express in December 1986. Every territory he worked, he left a mark. Every locker room he entered, he earned respect. not just for his look and his charisma, but for his legitimate toughness. Rick Rude was a genuinely dangerous man, and everyone in the business knew it. Stories of his real-life fighting ability were legendary. Other wrestlers, men who made their living in a physical business, would go out of their way to avoid getting on Rick Rude's bad side. That kind of respect cannot be manufactured. It has to be earned, and Rude earned it every single day. In 1987, Rude made the jump to the World Wrestling Federation, debuting as the newest member of the Bobby Heenan family. And this is where Ravishing Rick Rude became an icon. Under Heenan's management, Rude perfected the character that would define his legacy. The pre-match ritual of demanding the music be cut, insulting every man in the arena as a fat, out-of-shape sweat hog, slowly removing his robe to reveal that impossibly sculpted physique, the custom airbrush tights, the hip swivel that drove the crowd insane. It was a masterclass in heel work, a performance so convincing and so perfectly executed that it set the template for an entire generation of wrestlers who came after him. Val Venis, The Rock, Scott Steiner, countless others owed a debt to what Rick Rude created. His feuds in the WWE were legendary. The first major program was against Heenan's former protege, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, establishing Rude as the new alpha of the Heenan family. But it was the program with Jake Roberts that truly cemented Rude as a top-tier heel. The angle was deceptively simple. During one of Rude's signature segments where Bobby Heenan would select a woman from the audience for Rude to kiss, the chosen woman turned out to be Cheryl Roberts, Jake's real-life wife. When Rude appeared weeks later wearing custom airbrush tights with Cheryl's face painted across them, Jake stormed the ring and ripped them right off. It was shocking television for 1988 and ignited a blood feud that captivated audiences for months. The storyline worked because Rude sold the arrogance so perfectly that you genuinely wanted to see Jake destroy him. And because underneath the character work, both men were exceptional in-ring performers who knew how to build a match. His rivalry with the Ultimate Warrior produced one of the most significant title changes of the era, when Rude defeated Warrior for the Intercontinental Championship at WrestleMania 5 in Atlantic City. That victory was a huge deal. The Warrior was being positioned as the next Hulk Hogan, and for Rude to be the man chosen to take the belt off him said everything about how highly the company valued his work. He would later main event SummerSlam 1990 against the Warrior in a steel cage match for the WWE Championship, proving that the company trusted him at the very highest level of the card. While he did not win the world title that night, the fact that he was in that spot speaks volumes. Bobby Heenan himself would later say that Rick Rude was one of the most talented performers he ever managed, a man who could talk, could work, and could make any opponent look like $1 million. Coming from the brain, the man who had managed Andre the Giant and countless other legends, that was the highest possible praise. But even during those glory years, there were cracks forming beneath the surface. The demanding schedule of the WWE, the constant travel, the toll on his body. Rude grew frustrated with his position and his pay. He felt that his name was being used to draw houses on tours, but Vince McMahon was paying him very little because he was not wrestling on those particular shows. In those days, before significant guaranteed money contracts, injured wrestlers were left to fend for themselves financially. Rude eventually quit the company over the money disputes. It was a decision born of principle, but it cost him dearly. He left the WWE at the peak of the wrestling boom, walking away from the biggest stage in the world because he believed he was being treated unfairly. After working independents and doing tours in all Japan, Rude debuted with WCW in late 1991, arriving as the masked Halloween Phantom before quickly revealing himself. He captured the United States Heavyweight Championship from Sting and became the centerpiece of Paul E. Dangerously's Dangerous Alliance, one of the greatest heel factions in wrestling history. Alongside Arn Anderson, Bobby Eaton, Larry Zbyszko, Steve Austin, and Medusa, Rude was involved in some of the most compelling television and pay-per-view content WCW produced during that era. His feuds with Sting and Ricky Steamboat elevated the entire product. Rude's career peaked in 1992 when many considered him the best heel in the entire business. He was tearing down houses with classic matches, his promos had reached an elite level, and his in-ring work had evolved into something truly special. He even made it to the finals of New Japan's prestigious G1 Climax tournament, the only foreigner ever to accomplish that feat at the time. But just as he hit his stride as a complete performer, injuries began breaking him down. Bulging discs in his neck forced him to vacate the United States Championship after a reign of nearly 14 months, a reign that still stands as one of the longest in the title's history. Rude fought back from the neck problems and reinvented himself once more, winning the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship 3 times. But fate was about to deliver a blow from which he would never fully recover. May 1st, 1994. The Fukuoka Dome in Japan. A match against Sting for the WCW International World Heavyweight Championship. During the bout, Sting executed a suicide dive over the top rope to the outside. Rude caught him, but the momentum carried both men backward, and Rude's back slammed into the corner of a raised platform that surrounded the ringside area. The impact was devastating. Rude blew out his C4 and C5 vertebrae. The pain must have been excruciating, almost unimaginable. And yet, in a testament to his incredible toughness and professionalism, Rick Rude finished the match. He got up, continued working, hit a pile driver, delivered a knee drop off the top rope, and pinned Sting to win the championship. He never wrestled again. The injury destroyed everything. At just 36 years old, Rick Rude's in-ring career was over. The man who had built his entire identity around his physical perfection, who had made a living by demanding that crowds admire his body, was now broken. The championship victory was later reversed in storyline, and Rude found himself out of WCW, injured, bitter, and facing an uncertain future. What followed was a dark period. Rude had expected his Lloyd's of London insurance policy to provide a financial safety net, but the insurance company allegedly found a loophole to avoid paying out on wrestler policies. His safety net vanished overnight. In October 1994, Rude sued WCW for $630,000 and also named Sting in the lawsuit, blaming him for being careless with the dive. There was real heat between the two men. According to multiple accounts, including one from Buff Bagwell, Rude's frustration and desperation reached such a point that he actually pulled a gun on Sting in an attempt to pressure him into helping with the lawsuit. It was the act of a man in crisis, a man watching his livelihood slip away with no recourse and no support system from the industry that had used his body until it broke. Through the mid-1990s, Rude existed in a wrestling purgatory. He could not compete, but the business was all he knew. He made a brief appearance at ECW's Heatwave 1997, competing in a 6-man tag team cage match that would be the final actual match of his career. It was a one-off, a favor, a reminder of what he had been and what he could no longer be. Then came the call from Shawn Michaels. In August 1997, Rude returned to the WWE as the insurance policy for the group that would become D-Generation X, the groundbreaking faction that featured Shawn Michaels, Triple H, and Chyna. The DX name was officially coined in October 1997, with Rude as one of the founding members. Rude was not there to wrestle. He was there to be the muscle, the enforcer, the dangerous presence lurking behind the curtain with a briefcase that he was not afraid to use as a weapon. He assisted with sneak attacks on The Undertaker and generally added a layer of legitimate menace to a group that already had plenty of attitude. It was the perfect role for a man who could not compete in the ring but whose very presence communicated danger. And he played it brilliantly, looking sharp in his suits, carrying himself with the same arrogance that had defined his character for over a decade. But it was never going to last. The powder keg that was the WWE locker room in late 1997 was about to explode. When the Montreal Screwjob went down at Survivor Series on November 9th, 1997, with Vince McMahon orchestrating the premature end to the Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels match for the WWE Championship, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Rude was reportedly disgusted by what McMahon had done to Hart. According to Hart himself, Rude stayed in the locker room during the physical confrontation between Bret and Vince, then immediately called Eric Bischoff at WCW to inform him that what had happened was real and not part of any storyline. Because Rude was working on a per-appearance basis rather than a full-time contract, he was legally free to negotiate with the competition. And driven by both his moral outrage over the screw job and the practical reality that WCW was offering guaranteed money, he did exactly that. What happened next became one of the most iconic moments of the Monday Night War. On November 17, 1997, Rick Rude appeared on both Monday Night Raw and WCW Monday Nitro on the same night. Raw was pre-taped, so Rude had already filmed his appearance before showing up live on Nitro, sporting a mustache in contrast to the full beard he had worn during his last weeks in the WWE, openly mocking the company as a sinking ship. He referred to the company as the Titanic. It was an audacious move, and it made Rude the only person in history to appear on both competing shows on the same evening. Back in WCW, Rude was paired with his childhood friend Curt Hennig as part of the NWO. He served as Hennig's on-camera manager and was later used as an announcer for the WCW Backstage Blast pay-per-view broadcasts on DirecTV. But his role diminished over time. By late 1998, both Rude and Hennig were off television due to various issues. Rude had dealt with a health scare when he was thought to have testicular cancer, which later turned out to be a spermatozoa. The NWO reunion in January 1999 happened without him. His last WCW appearance came on the April 5, 1999 edition of Nitro Backstage Blast. He had been trying to get out of his WCW contract since December 1998, reportedly wanting to return to the WWE, where the real money and the real opportunities were, because Rick Rude had not given up. Despite the broken back, despite the 5 years away from the ring, despite everything, he was training for a comeback. He wanted to wrestle again. Friends and colleagues who saw him during this period said he was working incredibly hard, taking martial arts classes to develop a new style of working. He wanted to learn how to wrestle in a more upright position, to use judo-based techniques that would put less strain on his damaged spine. Those who witnessed his progress said he was a natural, that the athleticism which had always defined him was still very much intact. The dream of returning to the ring was not some delusional fantasy. It was a real, tangible goal that he was actively pursuing with the same intensity he had brought to everything else in his life. But there was another side to this period. A darker side. Sources within WCW reported that Rude had been drinking heavily in the weeks leading up to his death. He was allegedly consuming alcohol at the DirecTV Backstage Blast broadcasts. On April 9, 1999, just 11 days before his death, Rude was arrested near his home in Alpharetta on a driving under the influence charge. Blood test results from that arrest were still pending when he died. Ken Patera, speaking years later, relayed that the Anvil had told him Rude had lost his mind in those final weeks, though the specifics were never elaborated upon. This is all hearsay, and Patera himself acknowledged that much, but it paints a picture of a man who was struggling, who was self-medicating, who was dealing with chronic pain and frustration, and the psychological toll of watching an industry he loved move on without him. The medications were a constant. Rude had testified in 1994 that he had used anabolic steroids to manage joint pain and increase muscle mass. The transition from active wrestler to retired wrestler did not mean a transition away from the substances that had kept his body functioning at a superhuman level for over a decade. Painkillers, muscle relaxants, growth hormone supplements, the cocktail of drugs that had become tragically common in the wrestling business. For a man who was training to make a comeback, the temptation to use anything and everything that might accelerate his recovery and restore his physique must have been overwhelming. And then there was GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyric acid. Known on the streets as the date rape drug, known in fitness circles as a powerful growth hormone stimulant that could increase metabolism and burn fat while a person slept. In the late 1990s, GHB use was rampant in the wrestling business. Dave Meltzer reported in the Wrestling Observer that at the time of Rude's death, there had been at least 5 instances in the previous 6 weeks alone of current WCW and WWE performers experiencing some form of overdose on GHB, ranging from minor to severe. The drug was everywhere. It was cheap, it was effective for physique enhancement, and it was incredibly dangerous, particularly when mixed with other substances or alcohol. This brings us to the final 48 hours. On Sunday, April 18th, 1999, Rick Rude was 2 weeks removed from his last WCW appearance and 11 days removed from his DUI arrest. He was 40 years old. He was living in a comfortable home in Alpharetta, Georgia, a suburb north of Atlanta, with his wife Michelle, their 8-year-old son Richard Jr., their 5-year-old daughter Marissa, and their 21-month-old son Colton. He was a member of the Alpharetta First United Methodist Church. By every outward measure, he was a family man trying to find his way back to the only career he had ever known. Those close to him during this period described a man caught between two worlds. On one hand, there was the devoted father who talked excitedly to other wrestlers about his 3 children, who coached their sports teams, who drove them to school every morning. On the other hand, there was the former superstar who was dealing with chronic pain, substance dependency, and the gnawing frustration of being sidelined during what should have been the prime earning years of his career. The Attitude Era was exploding. Stone Cold Steve Austin, The Rock, Mick Foley, these men were making more money than any generation of wrestlers before them. And Rick Rude, who had helped lay the groundwork for everything the business had become, was on the outside looking in. The weekend of April 18th and 19th passed without incident, at least as far as public records indicate. Rude would have been going through his normal routine, training, spending time with his children, dealing with the ongoing legal consequences of his DUI arrest. He may have been in contact with associates about his efforts to get released from his WCW contract. He may have been making calls to people in the WWE about potential opportunities once he was free. These were the mundane mechanics of a life in transition. On Monday, April 19th, Rude went about his day. WCW, Monday. Nitro aired that evening, the show he had so recently been a part of. The show where he had served as Curt Hennig's manager, where he had provided commentary for Backstage Blast. Now he was just a viewer, if he watched at all. The Monday Night War raged on without him. The wrestling world continued to turn. That night, as April 19th became April 20th, the final hours of Rick Rude's life began to count down. On the morning of Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, Rick Rude woke up in his Alpharetta home and began what appeared to be a perfectly normal day. He got his 8-year-old son ready for school and drove him there, just as he did every morning. After dropping his boy off, Rude headed to a martial arts class. He had been attending regularly as part of his training regimen for his in-ring comeback. He was learning judo techniques, working on grappling from an upright position, doing everything he could to rebuild his body into something that could withstand the rigors of professional wrestling once more. After his martial arts session, Rude went to hit some golf balls. It was a normal suburban morning for a man who had once been one of the most recognizable figures in professional wrestling. Driving his kid to school, working out, hitting the driving range. These were the rhythms of a life that had been stripped of the adrenaline and chaos and glory of the squared circle and replaced with the quiet routines of an Atlanta suburb. At some point during the day, Rude returned home. His wife Michelle had gone out shopping. His mother-in-law was at the house, presumably helping with the younger children. What happened inside that house during the afternoon hours of April 20th would become the subject of speculation, debate, and heartbreak for years to come. Sometime in the afternoon, Rick Rude took medications. The exact substances and quantities would later be cataloged in an autopsy report as mixed medications. Whether this was a deliberate attempt to take his own life, as some like Honky Tonk Man and Jake Roberts would later speculate, or whether it was simply the latest in a long series of doses that his battered body had come to require, or whether it was an accidental miscalculation in the dangerous cocktail of substances he had been consuming, no one can say with certainty. What is known is that empty prescription pill bottles were found near where he collapsed. At approximately 5 p.m. on Tuesday, April 20th, 1999, Michelle Rude returned home from shopping. What she found when she walked through the door would shatter her world forever. Her husband was on the floor, barely breathing, with only a faint pulse. Some reports indicate it was actually his mother-in-law who first discovered him with a light pulse and shallow breathing near his bed, while the Mike Mooneyham account from the Charleston Post and Courier states it was his daughter who found him unconscious. Alpharetta Police Lieutenant Randy Johnson confirmed that a number of empty prescription pill bottles were found near Rude's bed. Regardless of who found him first, regardless of the precise location within the home, the scene was the same. The Ravishing one, the man with the most famous physique in wrestling history, the man who had demanded audiences admire his physical perfection, was lying motionless, clinging to life by the thinnest of threads. Michelle called 911 immediately. The call went out and paramedics from the Alpharetta Emergency Services were dispatched to the suburban home. When they arrived, they found Rude in critical condition, unresponsive, his vital signs dangerously weak. They loaded him into an ambulance and began working frantically to revive him, administering whatever emergency interventions they could. According to one early report from a wrestling news source, the paramedics actually managed to bring Rude back briefly during the ambulance ride. His heart started beating with more strength. His breathing showed signs of recovery. For a few desperate, agonizing moments, there may have been a flicker of hope that the Ravishing one would fight his way back from the brink the way he had fought his way back from so many other setbacks throughout his life. But whatever damage the mixed medications had done to his cardiovascular system, whatever cascade of organ failure had been triggered by the toxic combination of substances coursing through his veins, the damage was too severe to reverse. Rick Rude was rushed to North Fulton Medical Center, the hospital nearest to his Alpharetta home. Despite the efforts of the paramedics in the ambulance and the emergency room doctors at the hospital, Rude went into cardiac arrest. His heart, overwhelmed by the toxic combination of substances in his system, simply stopped. Ravishing Rick Rude was pronounced dead on the evening of April 20th, 1999. He was 40 years old. The news hit the wrestling world like a thunderbolt. This was not an elderly legend passing peacefully in his sleep. This was a 40-year-old man, a father of three, a performer who had been actively training for a comeback, found dead on his own floor, surrounded by empty pill bottles. The shockwave rippled through every locker room in America. An autopsy was performed the following day at the Fulton County Medical Examiner's office. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure resulting from an overdose of mixed medications. The specific substances were not publicly disclosed in detail, but GHB was widely believed to have been among them, along with steroids and possibly other prescription medications. The toxicology results would take weeks to come back, and even when they did, the full picture remained murky. Alpharetta Police Lieutenant Randy Johnson confirmed that empty prescription bottles had been found near Rude and noted the pending DUI charge from April 9th. The funeral was held on April 24th, 1999, at the Roswell Funeral Home in Roswell, Georgia. Rick Rude was laid to rest at Green Lawn Cemetery in Roswell, where a memorial bench would later be placed by his three children. The wrestling community turned out to pay its respects. Friends, colleagues, and rivals alike acknowledged the loss of a man who, for all his character's arrogance and swagger, was remembered by nearly everyone who knew him as one of the most loyal, genuine, and family-oriented men in the business. Bret Hart, one of Rude's closest friends, spoke at length about what Rick had meant to him. Hart would later write extensively about Rude in his autobiography, describing him as one of the most decent people in professional wrestling, a man whose tough exterior masked a kind and generous heart. Rick Martel and Jacques Rougeau both talked about what a joy Rude had been in the locker room, how his presence lifted everyone around him. Even in an industry notorious for backstabbing and political maneuvering, almost no one had a bad word to say about Rick Rude the person. His wife Michelle, who was only 33 years old at the time of his death, told reporters that her husband was nothing like the person he portrayed in the ring. He was a great family man, she said. He lived for his kids, and he ate and slept wrestling. Those words encapsulate the tragedy of Rick Rude's death, as well as anything ever could. He was a man who loved two things above all else, his family and his profession, and it was the relentless physical demands of the latter that ultimately took him away from the former. The aftermath of Rude's death exposed the ugly underbelly of the wrestling business in the late 1990s. WCW, the company he had most recently worked for, barely acknowledged his passing. While the WWE mentioned him on its weekend programming and dedicated a brief tribute, and ECW paid tribute on its television shows with Paul Heyman, offering heartfelt words about a man he deeply respected, and independent promotions across the country held moments of silence before their shows that weekend. WCW gave Rude approximately 30 seconds of airtime before continuing with business as usual. There was no 10-bell salute. There was no video package celebrating his contributions to the company. There was no moment where the announcers paused to reflect on the loss of a man who had given some of the best years of his career to their product. It was a callous, dismissive response that drew immediate and fierce criticism from fans, journalists, and wrestling insiders alike, though it was sadly consistent with the company's approach during a period when wrestler deaths were becoming disturbingly, horrifyingly common. Because Rick Rude was not dying in isolation. His death came during an era that would later be recognized as one of the darkest chapters in professional wrestling history. Brian Pillman had died in 1997 at 35. Louis Spicolli had died in 1998 at 27. Rude was the latest name added to a growing list that already included Kerry Von Erich, Buzz Sawyer, Eddie Gilbert, Art Barr, and too many others. The combination of grueling schedules, inadequate medical oversight, rampant drug use, and a culture that rewarded physical excess while punishing vulnerability had created a killing machine that chewed up bodies and spit out obituaries. At the time of Rude's death, there was no wellness policy in the WWE or WCW. There were no regular drug tests, no mandatory medical evaluations, no support systems for wrestlers dealing with addiction or chronic pain. It would take the death of Eddie Guerrero in 2005, 6 years later, before WWE finally implemented a comprehensive wellness program that included regular testing and consequences for violations. By then, countless more wrestlers from Rude's generation and the generation that followed would be dead. There is a particularly cruel irony in the manner of Rick Rude's death. Here was a man who had spent his entire career being defined by his body. His character was built on physical perfection. His entrance was literally an invitation for the audience to admire his physique. His custom tights, his flexing, his hip swivel, everything about Ravishing Rick Rude communicated a man who had achieved mastery over his own physical form. And yet it was that same body, abused by years of steroids and painkillers and the accumulated trauma of thousands of matches, that betrayed him in the end. The temple he had spent a lifetime building became his tomb. There is also the haunting question of what might have been. At 40, Rick Rude was the same age that Diamond Dallas Page had been when DDP was just beginning his rise to main event status in WCW. The comeback he was training for was not unrealistic. His martial arts training was progressing well. Those who saw him work said he still had the natural ability that had always set him apart. Had he been able to return to the ring during the Attitude Era or the early 2000s, had his body been able to hold up, had he not fallen victim to the same pharmaceutical nightmare that was claiming so many of his peers, the second act of Rick Rude's career could have been something extraordinary. Instead, we are left with the legacy of what was and the tragedy of what could have been. We are left with the image of that magnificent physique draped across the top rope, the sound of that commanding voice demanding silence, the arrogant sneer, the hip swivel, the rude awakening. We are left with the memory of one of the greatest heel characters in the history of professional wrestling, a man who was so good at being bad that he changed the entire template for how villains could present themselves. In 2017, 18 years after his death, Rick Rude was posthumously inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame as part of the class of 2017. It had been long overdue. For years, fans and insiders had expressed frustration that one of the greatest heel performers in history had been snubbed by the Hall. Ricky Steamboat, one of his greatest rivals and a man who had shared the ring with Rude during some of the most intense matches of the early 1990s WCW era, served as the inductor. Steamboat spoke with genuine emotion about the talent and the man he had known. Michelle, Marissa, and Richard Jr. accepted the honor on behalf of their father and husband. The standing ovation that greeted his name that night in the arena was long, loud, and deeply felt. It was proof that even after nearly 2 decades, the wrestling world had not forgotten Ravishing Rick Rude. The fans who had grown up booing him, who had hated him for his arrogance and his swagger and his disrespect, now stood and applauded his memory with tears in their eyes. That is the mark of a truly great performer. When the heel makes you cry at his memorial, you know he was special. But there was one person who could not be there to see it. Rude's youngest son, Colton, the baby who had been just 21 months old when his father died, was killed in a motorcycle accident on September 3, 2016, in Rome, Georgia. He was only 19 years old. The cruelty of that loss, a son who never got to know his father dying young himself, is almost too much to bear. A memorial bench at Green Lawn Cemetery now connects father and son in death, two lives cut impossibly short. The final 48 hours of Rick Rude were in many ways indistinguishable from any other 48 hours in the life of a man trying to pick up the pieces. He went to martial arts class. He hit golf balls. He drove his son to school. He came home to a house full of the people who loved him most. There were no dramatic confrontations, no final promos, no moments of cinematic clarity where the doomed hero stares into the camera and delivers a soliloquy about the meaning of life. There was just a man, a deeply flawed and deeply human man, going through the motions of an ordinary day. And then there was silence. The music had been cut for the last time. Rick Rude deserved better. He deserved better from the wrestling business that used his body until it broke and then discarded him. He deserved better from the medical establishment that handed out prescription pills like candy and asked no questions about how they were being used. He deserved better from a culture within professional wrestling that normalized substance abuse and treated addiction as a personal failing rather than a systemic crisis. He deserved better from all of us, the fans who cheered the spectacle without ever stopping to ask what it cost the men and women performing it. His story is not unique, and that is perhaps the most damning indictment of all. Rick Rude was one of dozens of wrestlers from his era who died young from the cumulative effects of a career spent destroying their bodies for our entertainment. The list is long and getting longer, and every name on it represents a family shattered, a potential unrealized, a life that should have lasted decades longer than it did. And if his story makes you angry, if it makes you sad, if it makes you question why this business keeps eating its own, then good. It should. Because the only way to honor the memory of Rick Rude and everyone like him is to demand that the industry does better, that it protects its performers, that it treats their health as something more valuable than a pay-per-view buy rate, that it never allows another 40-year-old father of three to be found on his floor surrounded by empty pill bottles while the show goes on without him. Rest in peace, Ravishing Rick Rude. Gone far, far too soon. And if you made it to the end of this one, drop a like and subscribe to the channel. We have got a lot more stories like this coming your way. Until next time.